Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the To Hull and Back podcast back for another season. Today, it's an opposition preview ahead of Hull City's perhaps difficult opening fixture away at Norwich City. We're proudly sponsored by Kingfisher Fisheries and Old Zoological Bar. Thank you very much to Adam from the Pinken, which I think has one of the best explanations for the naming of that. Because, run it by the listeners again. Why is it called the Pinken, Adam?
Yeah, so it goes back quite a way now in terms of the print. Back in the day, the Pinken was printed on pink paper, so that is the sort of reason behind the name. And yeah, it's sort of a long stay name for us now. And I think there's been lots of other sort of green uns, and that was the Ipswich one, and that's now gone. So I think we're probably the only one left.
Oh, that's a shame. I mean, a bit hypocritical because I'm, just on social media, and this is a digital internet podcast. But it's a shame that we're losing all of those sort of physical mediums. But thank you very much for coming on. So Norwich City, when I last spoke to you, we lost 3-1, and it was Rossini had only been there for a few months, and David Wagner was the new Norwich City manager. So I'll just ask you, how have the last few months been as a Norwich City fan, and how has David Wagner, done as Norwich City manager so far?
Yeah, it's sort of a bit of a mixed spell for him. He came in around the January time after we departed with Dean Smith as manager. It was a really difficult spell under him, and the club decided to go a different way. And Stuart Webber, our sporting director, reunited with David Wagner. They were the two at Huddersfield that brought such success, took the club to the Premier League. And I think most Norwich fans maybe at the time were a little bit undecided on the appointment. It kind of felt like Stuart Webber was maybe going for one of his mates, I suppose you'd kind of bracket it. And there was a little bit of sort of, maybe a bit of uncertainty, but he came in. We started really well under him, actually. We got a 4-0 win away at Preston and a 4-2 win away at Coventry, which, granted, they then got to the playoff final, looked like a really good result. But things maybe turned for the worse a little bit towards the end of the season, just one win in 11. And we ended up finishing 13th, which for a side that was hoping to be in the top two was a pretty difficult end to the campaign, I suppose. And most Norwich fans felt pretty disappointed and maybe a little bit disillusioned with the football club at points. But, you then get the summer transfer window come around, and I suppose the sort of pessimism maybe turns into optimism. We've made some pretty good signings on paper, which I'm sure we'll come around to talk about. But yeah, I'm feeling more optimistic than maybe I was towards the end of the last season, which was maybe not the most fun in the world of supporting Norwich City Football Club.
So you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but was that the first time since maybe 2018 Norwich haven't gone up or down? Because they are one of the sort of stereotypical yo-yo clubs, and it's one of my pet peeves that parachute payments means it sort of makes it very difficult to, not get promoted, and then maybe getting promoted so often, quite good enough for the Premier League. So how does it feel to go into another season in the same league for once?
Yeah, I think probably a little bit different. I think even when you sort of come down from the Premier League, there's maybe an expectation that you'll be in amongst the top six or probably the top two. And I don't know, even from the start of the last season, I wasn't 100% certain that was going to be the case. Dean Smith hadn't really shown anything to kind of get the fans on board that they were going to be in the top two. We actually started the season relatively well, and I think we're top of the league actually around the September time, and things obviously petered in a way that ended pretty miserably for Dean Smith, and then David Wagner couldn't really turn it around either. So yeah, I don't know. I think this time round, there's maybe no expectation on us. We can kind of, get on with this season without any fans of opposition teams putting us in the top six mix, which is, usually the case. We usually end up being sort of the team that's tipped to win the league. So it's interesting not being that. And actually, sometimes Norwich thrive in those kind of conditions where they've maybe not spent big money on players. They've brought in lots of free signings, and maybe they can go a little bit under the radar and surprise a few teams. And that's ultimately what they've done under Daniel Farke. So I'm hoping that could be a similar case this season.
I mean, sorry to linger on the failure of last season, but you look at Norwich, and some of the justification I saw about getting relegated and promoted was that you're trying to be more financially stable. Does not getting promoted and even finishing in the bottom half last season show that maybe a bit more ambition at the club over the last few years would have helped, maybe been better?
Yeah, we have got a relatively new sort of sponsor, or I want to say sponsor, sort of owner in terms of in the background. Looks like he's about to become level with Delia and Michael in terms of shares. His name's Mark Atanasio. He's an American who I think most Norwich fans are pinning their hopes on to try and invest a little bit of money, although he owns the Brewers baseball team over in America and he doesn't really tend to put money into it. So I think there's probably a few reservations that actually will still go the same way in terms of self-financing and trying to sort of bring in young players, develop them, sell them on for big fees, and then reinvest the money in hopefully better areas, which is probably been the failure for Norwich, actually, if more than anything. Maybe not necessarily the lack of spending. It's been more where we spent the money has been done pretty poorly. You know, the likes of Milo Rashica for 7 or 8 million never really turned out to be a big player for us. Christos Jolis, who looks like he's about to leave the club on loan. We paid £9 million for him, and we've scored about 3 goals over his whole Norwich City career so far. So I'd say that's really where the failing is the sort of recruitment. And I think most Norwich fans are sort of intrigued actually to see the players we've brought in this year are maybe of a different caliber of players in the past. We've tended to go for younger players from abroad that maybe are a little bit unknown, where this time round we've gone for the likes of Ashley Barnes and Shane Duffy, which, you know, every person in English football will be aware of. So it's certainly
Who are they?
Yeah,
No,
exactly.
I do know
I think
them.
yeah, the strategy is very much different. So I'm intrigued to see how it gets on, because I think at the end of last season, we probably did lack leadership and sort of experience at points. And that's probably been where they've addressed the issues. So, yeah, I think it could go either one of two ways, really. We'll either have a really good season or it could be one which is pretty miserable again.
I suppose it does go against the thing that because you were going up and down, but is there a feeling that Norwich sort of stagnated or plateaued, and maybe with a new system and new owners, even if you don't get promoted this season or next season, perhaps the same thing wouldn't happen again in the future? So is it more optimistic now that maybe things behind the scenes are changing as well?
Yeah, our sporting director, Stuart Webber, has also announced he's leaving. So we'll have a different sporting director in place by March. He's currently serving a notice period, although that might be done before that. So I think, yeah, a new sporting director, I say when Mark Atanasio eventually arrives and becomes sort of level with Delia and Michael, it maybe feels that, yeah, I think there's probably then a different look at the ownership, a different sporting director, maybe a different kind of fresh energy around the football club, and the fans maybe have something else to get on board with, because as you kind of say, I think there's a tiredness to the current project. It started back in sort of 2018 under 2017 actually under Daniel Farker, and that sort of project came to an end. And I think Norwich maybe tried to go a different route with Dean Smith, a sort of well-known English manager who's sort of, you know, been in the Championship, been in the Premier League before, but that didn't really work. And I say we've lost our identity now. We're not really a self-funding club like we were, and we maybe don't look at bringing through academy players like we were. So I think there's maybe a different feeling around the club that's sort of relatively negative, and the fans are quite apathetic at the moment towards the sort of the club and the way it's being ran and sort of the sort of behind the scenes stuff. So I think this maybe is the right time for a change. And yeah, I think there's still hope that we'll be in the top 6. I think there's still an expectation that we can be competing for that, but maybe not like last season where the objective was top 2 and they ultimately failed.
Yeah, I mean, I think any team that maybe didn't finish below 20th, I think has a chance or a hope at the playoff, perhaps, in this sort of league. I mean, it's very competitive as always. I know it's difficult with the parachute payments teams coming down, but it's good to hear that you're not so pessimistic that you don't have a chance at the playoffs, because the season's not started yet, so anything could happen. Last question about the past before we go on to the future and looking ahead to the new season. Teemu Pukki has left the club after many goals, many years. So how will it be without him? Because you think of Norwich, you think of Teemu Pukki. It became a bit of part of the furniture. So is it sad to lose him?
Yeah, I think there was probably sort of an air of sadness at the end of last season. We had a last game against Blackpool with nothing riding on it. And of course, that the only thing that was really tagged onto that game was Teemu Pukki's farewell. And he got a really good send-off. And he's now obviously taken himself over to America to challenge himself there. He's obviously playing in the MLS for Minnesota. So it's a completely different league for him. Yeah, I'd say there's an air of disappointment that he's left, but I think he probably was a player that needed to leave before now. I think last summer he wanted out. There were sort of rumours that, he might be able to get a move to the Premier League or one of the other top tier leagues, I suppose, in Europe. And that never materialised. And he had a relatively good start to the campaign, but he really didn't look the same player in the second half of the season. We were struggling to create the chances for him. Maybe the movement and the pace that he had that was so, crucial in some of the successful Norwich teams, he'd lost that. Him him and Buendia was such a good relationship and such a good partnership. And as soon as Buendia left, it kind of felt like he maybe never had that creative player that could, sort of find the spaces for him. And the relationships with other players wasn't the same. So I think it was the right time to move him on now. Of course, we've got Josh Sargent in the background who scored 13 goals last season, but spent most of the time out on the wing because Teemu Pukki was kind of the main man up front. So Josh Sargent being sort of 22, 23, this is now his time to hopefully be the number 9 that Norwich need to score the goals.
Yeah, I suppose he was representative of that old guard with Farker in those Premier League years. Maybe moving him on is a bit of a sort of not spiritual representative, or I can't think of the term, but that sort of thing. If you understand what I mean, moving him on. Really can't think of the word. It will come to me later on. But as you said, Josh Sargent, he scored a lot of goals last year. I mean, he started on like a house on fire with Oscar Estepinian. They were at the top of the goal scoring chart. So is he your best player at the moment? Who's the player to watch out for City fans on Saturday?
I'd say he's up there, but I think Gabriel Sara, the central midfielder, the Brazilian who maybe struggled when he first arrived at Carrow Road last year. He came with an injury and maybe didn't suit the Dean Smith sort of style of football. And actually, funny enough, his 2 dogs that were still in Brazil came over in January. And since then, he's kind of just been a different player. It's almost as if that was the thing that was holding him back a little bit, that sort of family element, which is often what you need when you're adapting from, such a different culture to then, from Brazil to Norwich is quite different. So the second half of the season, he really ripped it up, scored some really great goals. I think he got one against Hull, actually, at Carrow Road. And yeah, ever since then, he was probably the one player that maybe gave Norwich fans hope towards the end of last season in a side that was really lacking creativity, lacking energy. He was the one consistent player who, arguably, I'd say if he'd have performed to that level for the whole season, I don't think he'd be a Norwich player this season. He'd be back in the Premier League with a different side. And that's probably where he's going to end up. I think this could be the year for him that if Norwich don't get promoted, he probably won't be here for next season. So it's an important season for him to sort of continue the levels he was at towards the end of last season, but also for Norwich to hopefully get themselves promoted so he doesn't end up being one of these players that they have to sell on for big money to another club.
Symbolic. I was trying to think of symbolic for Teemu Pukki leaving. So you mentioned some summer signings. You've got the Austrian striker, Ashley Barnes. Austrian international, I guess. He was maybe, I think, your first signing. That seemed to happen just immediately after the season ended. So what will he bring? Because, of course, he got promoted last year with Norwich, Burnley. So I guess that's experience to bring in.
Yeah, he arrived just sort of 2 or 3 days after that pretty dismal game against Blackpool, and maybe that kind of got the fans interested in the business we were going to do this summer. I mean, when he first arrived, I wasn't too certain. He's not really a natural goal scorer, but ultimately he played in a Burnley side every single game near enough, and a side that was one of the best to grace the Championship. So you can't really knock that. And I think what you can see about him just in pre-season is he's going to bring sort of a bit of hunger and a bit of competitive edge to a side that maybe lacked that last season, but he's also experienced, and that experience could hopefully rub off on the likes of Josh Sargent and Adam Eder, who are both young strikers that are maybe sort of trying to get their break in the Norwich City side and hopefully, become one of the better strikers in, I suppose, the Championship, eventually try and make themselves Premier League players. So I think in terms of the experience and the leadership he's going to bring, it's a great signing. And what we've seen in pre-season is he's not a player that's scared to maybe throw an elbow or get himself stuck in, which sometimes that's maybe a player Norwich have lacked, just that player that's in those gritty games, away at Stoke on a Tuesday night where you just need that one player to, maybe head the ball in a certain, place or get themselves stuck in at certain points. He's the player that's going to do that and maybe pull the other players over the line. So actually it looks a very shrewd bit of business, a free agent signing. So there's no real sort of, I suppose, risk attached to it. So looking forward to see what he can bring. And I think he will be a player who will be in the starting 11 on Saturday.
Now, and you've brought in a few fairly experienced defenders, Shane Duffy and Jack Stacey. They both look like very astute signings as well. I mean, I think Stacey's played for Bournemouth and they've been very good over the last few years, and Duffy from Brighton, of course. So will they come straight into the starting 11, into the defence? Because I think having those two, that's half a good back four right there.
Yeah, Norwich actually over pre-season. Not that you can read much into it. Defensively, have
Un-
looked the best.
Unbeaten as well.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, and defensively, we look unbelievable. I don't think we've conceded many goals at all. We conceded, I think, 2 in the first 2 pre-season games, but since then we've only conceded 1, keeping clean sheets against the likes of Darmstadt, Olympiacos. Some relatively big sides across Europe. So I'd say those two are quite a big reason for that. Shane Duffy, a player with lots of experience, a player who's played, I think, over 150 games in the Premier League in a relatively successful Brighton side. And you can see that experience already rubbing off on some of our younger players in the back line. We've, of course, got Andrew Omobamidele, another Irish centre-back, and you can see that he's already looking at Shane Duffy as almost an idol and someone that can hopefully teach him lots more, sort of what he needs to know in the game, because you could see kind of that, I suppose, naivety and frailty in his game still, being how young he is. And I think Shane Duffy's the perfect player to hopefully help, him build a career, that will eventually lead him to the top. And yeah, Jack Stacey, another player who's well known across, his sort of time at Luton and Bournemouth, a player that's got promoted out of this league before. Of course, Max Aarons looks like this is probably his time to leave. So Jack Stacey's the kind of ultimate professional replacement, a player who's maybe still in his peak. I think, he's only 27, 28. So there's still a lot more to come from him in terms of his career. He's maybe a little bit younger than, Ashley Barnes and Shane Duffy. And I think what we've seen in pre-season is he's a player who's willing to get forward, but also can defend, which is probably something Norwich's fullbacks haven't really been able to do in the past. Jamal Lewis, Max Aarons, both great going forwards, but defensively not that great. So I think Jack Stacey probably addresses that issue, but you can also see he's got the ability to find the ball when it comes to the final third. He can deliver a cross, which could be a really good component when you've got the likes of Ashley Barnes and Josh Sargent, who are both relatively tall and pretty good with a head, I suppose.
Yeah. What about the 2 wingers you've got? Is it Signs? Something
Yeah,
like
Borja Signs. Yeah.
what's his deal?
Yeah, so he's a player we've picked up on a free. He had a clause in his contract with Uranaspor in Turkey. Basically, they got relegated. That meant he could effectively, cut his clause or his contract there and rip it up and eventually become a free agent. And Norwich executed that, brought him in, a 22-year-old Spanish winger. I think he got sort of over double figures in terms of goal and assist contributions last year in a pretty poor side in the Turkish top flight. So there's a lot of excitement around him. The only caveat is that he picked up an injury in training only a week or so in. So he hasn't actually played at all in pre-season, and he's not going to be available for Saturday either. It looks like, well, we actually got an update today. I was at David Wagner's press conference, and he said that Sainz looks like he's going to be back in 2 or 3 weeks. So it's looking relatively positive that he might be back sort of back for the end of August fixtures, which I think there's a lot of excitement around him, and maybe he's the creative spark that Norwich haven't really had for a while. But of course, as it is with any player that comes in from abroad, and until you've sort of seen them in the flesh, it's really difficult to make a judgment on how successful they'll be.
Yeah, I mean, Hull had various attacking players from Turkey that got injured a week into training. So, I mean, from the way those transfers went, that isn't a very good first sign, because we really had problems with that last year. But hopefully for you lot, I'm surprised if that was a possibility. We weren't straight on that. We love signing players from the Super League. What about, is it Fastnacht from, I'm presuming, Germany? Is he equally as exciting?
Yeah, she's a Swiss international, played in the World Cup, played in the Euros. He came from Young Boys in the Swiss Super League, a player who's played Champions League football, Europa League football, and of course has worked with David Wagner previously at Young Boys, where David Wagner was manager for a spell. And he's a player we picked up for sort of around about the 1.5 million euros, which is actually the only player we've signed with an actual fee attached to them this summer. All the rest have been free signings. So I think there's probably a little bit of hope and expectation around him. All but 2 seasons of his footballing career, he's always contributed 10 goals or more. So for a winger, that's pretty good stats. And of course, playing in a relatively decent league in Switzerland and playing Europa League football and Champions League football, that's not a record to be knocked. And I think he's a player that if he was a little bit younger and there wasn't the David Wagner factor, he's probably not coming to Norwich City. So I think there's a lot of hope and expectation that he could be a pretty pivotal player if we can keep him fit this season. He physically looks like a big player as well, which is something obviously in the Championship. That physicality is something that's quite crucial if you're going to have success. And he's maybe a winger that doesn't fit the kind of natural mold of a winger where they're quite small and agile. He looks a lot more big and physical. And I'm excited to see what he can bring. We've only really sort of seen 45 minutes of him because he arrived quite late in pre-season. So he played at Carrow Road last weekend when we beat Olympiacos 2-0 for 45 minutes. And yeah, he showed some pretty positive signs. But of course, as with anything, it's going to take him a little bit of time to adapt to the league and living in a different country, because he's a player who's always been based in Switzerland. So he's never really had a career move that's taken him abroad. So of course, it's going to be one I'm going to watch with intrigue, but I'm relatively optimistic that could be the signing and that Norwich needed this summer to sort of address the goal scoring issues.
Well, you seem pretty impressed with the players you've signed so far, and if they can replace perhaps Pukki and Aarons and that quality, do you think Norwich have a good squad? So, what is the expectation for Norwich City this season?
Yeah, I've sort of seen, well, like with any other football club, I think there's probably been fans that have put us in the top 6 bracket. There's fans that have put us in the mid-table bracket, and fans that have put us at the bottom. I think it's really difficult to sort of gauge where we're going to be. Lots of different players that we've maybe never seen or not seen recently in terms of the age profile of these players. They're not players that Norwich have gone for in the past 5 seasons. So I think there's probably an air of kind of, I don't know, almost unexpectance in terms of where Norwich will be, and that sometimes can work for teams. They can thrive under that. I know Daniel Farker in his second season, when we brought the likes of Pukki, Vrancic, Buendia to the club. These are players that arrive for low fees, and I think most supporters within the Norwich fan base and probably outside of that all expect us to be a mid-table to lower half team, and we went on and won the league in a season that had the likes of Aston Villa, Leeds, Sheffield United, West Brom. So it can be done. They're not really, the sort of signings that maybe get other fans off their seat, in terms of they're not names of exciting players from abroad that could bring something drastically different to the league. They're all just very much household names, apart from the last 2 we mentioned. So I'm intrigued to see how we get on. If I was to sit here right now, I think we could be anywhere between 6th and 10th. That's kind of my gut instinct on where we'll be.
Well, yeah, I think that's probably where Hull are going to be. I mean, I haven't looked at. I was saying to you before the episode started, I haven't been aware of some of the biggest transfers in and out of the Championship this season. So, me predicting, well, I think I had to predict who was going to get relegated, and I said Birmingham, because I predict them to go down every season, because they almost do. But then I've seen everyone predicting them to be about 12th. So presumably they've signed some incredible players that I have no idea about. So I wouldn't dare even try and predict where Norwich are going to be. Although, yeah, if we ended up right next to each other around 10th, 11th-ish, that would probably be, not that surprising. So how do you think the first game's going to go? Because we were saying again, the last time Hull won in Norwich was 2013. Which, every time we do one of these opening things, that gets another year away. It was a long time ago. So the favour is in Norwich's favour. The odds are in their favour. So how do you think the first game's going to go?
Yeah, Norwich are typically slow starters in the Championship. We haven't actually really had a home game for an opening day for quite a while in the Championship. I actually looked back, our last home win at Carrow Road on an opening day of the season was 2002. So it's a record that spans 21 years of Norwich not winning on the opening day at home. So I suppose those kind of stats are always a little bit worrying. But then you look at the flip side. Yeah, Hull haven't won at Carrow Road for sort of over 10 years now as well. So there's kind of one stat that has to be broken. I'd say it's probably the perfect opening game for Norwich. Of course, we could have got a big side like a Leicester away, which would have maybe made it difficult for David Wagner. But I think he looks at it as a fixture at home. The fans need something, sort of a freshness, I suppose. And there's going to be a different energy about the stadium, maybe from last season. And I think there's an expectation they will go on and get a win on the opening game of the season, which is something that a lot of Norwich fans haven't said for a long time. Albeit, we always sort of, I suppose, approach these games with a little bit of trepidation in terms of there can go wrong. You can get results.
Yeah.
And teams come to Carrow Road, as we saw last season, maybe stick 10 men behind the ball. We struggle to break it down, and then they go and nick a 1-0 win. So I think I could see anything. But if I was to sort of pick an opening game, I would have said a home game, and ideally against a side that's winnable. And I'd probably look at this on paper and feel that is the case. Yeah.
I mean, really, some City fans could think, oh, well, that's a bit of an insult. But every single game in the Championship's winnable, really. And even more so for the bottom team at the top team, because that's just the sort of thing that happens in this league. Liam Smith has commented, 10th would be great, playoffs a dream for Hull. Is that same for Norwich City? Do you think, would you take 10th? I know you think you might be there. Would you be happy with that?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult one because there's kind of a debate, I suppose, amongst Norwich fans at the moment on social media and the ones we've spoken to, where they're kind of trying to sort of see what the objective should be for the club this season. And I'm not really certain where it is, if I'm being honest. I think if you were to stay 10th, most Norwich fans maybe would be still a little bit disappointed that would be the position they'd be in. I think that they want to probably be in the top 6. And I think if they do finish 10th, David Wagner's not here come next summer. So I'd say top 6 has still got to be the aim. But of course, given the league looks on paper a lot tougher this season, maybe than it did last season, I don't necessarily think that's going to be an easy or a given that Norwich will be in the top 6. But as we saw with the likes of Luton last season, a lot of it is just built on a really strong defence and the ability to grind out results. And Norwich have kind of brought in players that maybe suit that mould, and I think maybe give them a little bit more of a defensive structure that gives them the licence then to try and hit teams on the counter and get results at places where, you know, if you get results at those kind of grounds, you'll be in the top 6. So I'd hope for 6, but yeah, I could see them being anywhere between 6th and 10th, and I'm not sure 10th would still be deemed good enough for, say, David Wagner to be in his position come next August or May.
I mean, I suppose it depends how the season goes. If they fall a bit off at the end, and maybe just finish out the size of playoffs, because 10th can be like 2 or 3 points off 6th, can't it? Or it could be like 10 or 15. So I guess it depends on that. I don't really know whether I like people saying, sorry, but the Championships looks really competitive this year. Because isn't it every year? And people say that every year. I mean, last season, the playoffs was like the lowest points total you could get into 6th for a while. But then doesn't that mean it was more competitive? So I don't really know how that goes. But it does look strong this season. I more like to say League One looks strong, because a lot of big teams get relegated and go down there. I mean, it was very strong when the mighty Hull City were there a few years ago. It looked very big at that time. So we've talked a little bit about it, but can you predict what the starting 11 will be for Norwich City?
Yeah, I'm fairly confident that David Wagner will go with the 11 that started against Olympiacos at Carrow Road last week, and that'll be Angus Gunn in goal, Jack Stacey at right back, a back two of Ben Gibson and Shane Duffy. Left back will be Greek Demetrius Giannoulis. The central midfield pair, Gabriel Sauer and Kenny McLean. Fashnak will be on the right, probably a mix of either Onel Hernandez or Jonathan Rowe on the left. Ashley Barnes in the 10, and Josh Sargent will be the striker. And that's probably, I'd say, if you if I was a betting man, that would be where I'd be putting my money right now. And that's the team that will start on Saturday.
Yeah, are you happy with that lineup? Because I think I'm probably happy with maybe 10 players we could have in the whole lineup. I'm not sure about another winger, whether we have a really strong position there. So are you happy with that 11?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of Norwich fans that want a defensive midfielder, but David Wagner tends to play with a double pivot, sort of 2 in the central midfield rather than a sort of natural CDM. So that's not a player that Norwich will go out and bring in this window. And I think if you looked on paper, they've addressed a lot of the issues from last season. I think defensively, the experience they've now got in that back four probably fills me with a lot more confidence than maybe last season at points where at times we didn't really have any defence or central defenders actually fit. We were playing with CDMs in centre back because we were that light. So they seem to have sorted that issue. Creativity is probably where I fear the most. Norwich don't really have a sort of creative type player. I think Borja Sainz is going to be that player, but he's obviously not available. So it makes Norwich a lot more robust. I'd say they're a lot more of a side that's going to be kind of a unit as one. And we'll probably look to try and hit teams on the counter with the pace of Josh Sargent, Onel Hernandez, Jonathan Rowe. They're all quite quick players. And I think, yeah, it depends on whether teams can break Norwich down. If they fail to break Norwich down and on the counter, I think we've probably got the players in the strike force that can probably score goals. So that's going to be the recipe for success. But yeah, in terms of players, I'd maybe like to see a number 10 still arrive. But given that David Wagner's pretty sort of happy with this squad, I fear we won't really do any other business unless players leave Carrow Road this summer.
Okay, well, the last thing to do is just ask you for your score prediction for the exciting opening match of the next season.
Yeah, I feel relatively confident. I'm going to go 2-0 Norwich, which has been a theme of our recent pre-season games. As I say, not that I can read into that, but I think Norwich probably just about have enough. And given it's a home game, I think there's probably an expectation that they'll get off to a positive start. So Josh Sargent will get on the score sheet and Ashley Barnes for a debut goal. I'll go 2-0 Norwich.
Okay, not that you asked, but I'll offer it anyway. I think 1-1. We're very boring. We like to draw games under a senior, and I feel like we will have got a slight bit better, and Norwich would have got a slight bit worse than the game back in, was it February, March time last season, or April or January, I can't remember. So maybe 1-1. So I think that would be a reasonable thing. But if we did lose at Norwich, wouldn't be it would be kind of worrying, because Senior said he wanted us to be the best and like win every game, win the league basically in his first sort of meeting with the players, first day of pre-season. So that would make that clip very something to stick to beat him with. So hopefully that doesn't happen, because X will be absolutely horrible that day. So good luck for the season after the first game. Thank you very much for coming on. The Pink 'Un, I know you said it before on the show, but where can people find that on the internet and all that?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I appreciate that. Where you can find us, we're on Twitter /X at the Pink 'Un, Instagram at Pink 'Un, Facebook Pink 'Un as well. We've also got a YouTube channel where we do podcast previews, reviews. We speak to the managers. We've got all the press conferences on there. All the reaction will be on there as well after the game. On Saturday, we speak to fans, of course, as well. So there's lots of great content on the Pink 'Un YouTube channel. So that's well worth heading over to. And we're also on the pinkun.com website. We, of course, operate as a newspaper. So ultimately, there's lots of news, everything Norwich City related around game cycles, transfers, and everything from Norwich City will all be available there. So, if you're a Norwich or Hull fan and you want some, match content on Saturday, then we're a pretty good place to go.
Awesome. Was it you that spoke to Ant an hour ago or 2 hours ago? Good. Well, yes. So head over and watch the flip side of this, where you talk to our very own Ant Northgraves about the sort of Hull City side of that. So that's a good bit of collaboration there. So thanks for doing that. Thanks everyone for listening and watching and subscribing, liking, commenting, even leaving an abusive comment. It's good for the algorithm that we get any sort of engagement. So thank you very much. And we'll be back next week after thumping Norwich City in the opening game, hopefully. So thanks again, Adam, and we'll see you next week.